Welcome back to Auto Reviews. Today we are diving deep into one of the most fascinating pieces of American military history, the M1917 Light Tank. Now, when most people think of tanks, their minds jump to the massive steel beasts of World War II or the advanced, high-tech machines of the modern battlefield like the Abrams, Leopards, or even future generation stealth tanks. But long before those, America's journey into armored warfare began with a humble and now often overlooked machine, the M1917. In this video we're going to take a close look at its design, its performance, its place in history, and we'll even talk about how it stacks up in terms of cost and collectability today, for those interested in military vehicle restoration or private ownership. So buckle in, because this is a story that starts more than a century ago, at the dawn of the tank era. When the First World War erupted, tanks were a brand new invention. The British first fielded them in 1916 with the famous Mark I, a clunky rhomboid-shaped beast that looked like something out of a science fiction novel. The French soon followed with their own designs, and the most important of those was the Renault FT, a light tank that completely changed how the world thought about armored vehicles. Instead of being a huge, slow-moving fortress like the British tanks, the Renault FT was small, agile, and most importantly, it had a fully rotating turret. This design became the blueprint for nearly every tank that followed, even to this day. The Americans at the time had no experience building tanks, but they realized quickly they needed to get involved. By 1917, when the United States entered the war, the Renault FT had already proven itself on the battlefield, and the Americans decided the best course of action was to build their own version under license. That led to the creation of the M1917 Light Tank. On paper, it was almost identical to the Renault featuring. It had the same small size, about 16 feet long, just over 6 feet wide, and around 7 feet tall, with a crew of 2, a driver and a commander who doubled as gunner. Its weight came in around 7 tons, which was relatively light for a tank. Its top speed was roughly 5 to 6 miles per hour, depending on the terrain, which by today's standards seems painfully slow, but at the time it was considered adequate for infantry support. Performance-wise, the M1917 was equipped with a 4-cylinder gasoline engine that delivered around 42 horsepower. That might sound ridiculously underpowered, and by modern expectations it definitely is, but for a vehicle of its size and era, it was just enough to get the job done. It could climb small obstacles, cross trenches up to about 5 feet wide, and maneuver across shell-pocked battlefields. Its armor ranged from 6 to 22 mm thick, which provided protection against small arms fire and shrapnel, but was vulnerable to heavy machine guns and certainly to artillery. The armament varied depending on the version. Some M1917s were fitted with 8.30 caliber M1919 Browning machine gun, while others mounted a 37 mm M1916 cannon. The cannon was intended for use against enemy strongpoints in light vehicles, while the machine gun versions were better suited for mowing down infantry. The fact that the tank's turret could rotate 360 degrees gave it a huge advantage in flexibility compared to earlier tanks. Now, one of the interesting aspects of the M1917 is that although it was built for World War I, none of them actually saw combat in that war. Production delays, manufacturing challenges, and the time it took to set up an entirely new armored vehicle industry in the United States meant that by the time the first M1917s were rolling off the line, the armistice had already been signed. In total, about 950 were produced between 1918 and 1920, but they never got the chance to prove themselves in the war they were originally intended for. So what happened to them? Well, many were used in training during the interwar years. Some were deployed for internal security, such as during the Bonus Army riots in Washington, D.C., in 1932, where M1917 tanks were rolled into the Capitol to disperse protesting World War I veterans. Others were eventually given to Canada or sold off as surplus. By the time World War II arrived, the M1917 was hopelessly outdated, and America had moved on to far more capable designs like the M3 Stuart and eventually the Sherman. Let's talk about performance in context. When you compare the M1917 to modern tanks, it seems laughably weak. Its armor was paper-thin, its gun was tiny, and its speed was barely faster than a man jogging. But in 1917, this was cutting-edge technology. It gave soldiers mobile firepower, protection from small arms, and a psychological shock factor that was invaluable. Imagine being an infantryman in 1918 and suddenly seeing a steel monster with a cannon and machine gun rolling toward you. This was something brand new and terrifying. Now, moving to cost and value. Back when it was produced, each M1917 tank cost around $35,000 in 1918 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's close to $700,000 today. That's quite a price tag for what looks like a primitive machine by modern standards. But remember, this was a brand new industry. Everything had to be designed, tooled, and manufactured from scratch. America was essentially learning how to build tanks on the fly. As for today, the M1917 has become a rare collector's item. Only about a dozen survive in museums and private collections. If one were to come up for sale, which is incredibly rare, the price could easily be in the range of $200,000 to $500,000 depending on condition and originality. Restoring one is no small task either. Parts are virtually non-existent, so collectors have to fabricate components from scratch or salvage them from other historical vehicles. But for enthusiasts of military history, owning an M1917 is like owning the very first chapter of American armored warfare. The performance of the M1917 is obviously outdated, but when demonstrated at shows or reenactments, it still draws crowds. Watching one rumble along at its slow pace, the engine rattling, the tracks clanking, gives you a real sense of what those early tank crews experienced. The ride was rough, cramped, and extremely noisy. Crews often had to endure suffocating fumes inside, limited visibility, and the constant threat of breakdowns. But it also represented a sense of progress, of stepping into a new age of warfare where machines would dominate the battlefield. It's also worth noting how much influence the Renault FT and the M1917 had on later designs. The concept of a rotating turret, a driver in the front, and an engine in the rear became the standard layout for tanks around the world. Even modern tanks like the Abrams still follow this same basic formula, just on a much larger and more advanced scale. So while the M1917 itself never fought in a war, its design DNA lived on and shaped the future of armored warfare. For military enthusiasts today, the M1917 isn't about raw performance or modern capability, it's about legacy. It's about understanding where things started, and appreciating the technological leap it represented in its time. If you compare it to the British Mark I, the difference is night and day. The M1917, like the Renault Fort, was small, more mobile, and infinitely more practical. It was the seed from which the mighty oak of modern tank design would grow. So, if we were to rate the M1917 in terms of performance, price, and historical importance. Here's the breakdown. In raw battlefield performance, it's obviously obsolete, but historically it was revolutionary. In terms of price, it was expensive for its time and remains a costly collector's item today, but that reflects its rarity and importance. And in terms of significance, it's hard to overstate. This tank was America's first step into the armored age, and that makes it priceless in a sense. To wrap it up, the M1917 Light Tank might not be the most glamorous vehicle you'll ever hear about, and it certainly won't impress anyone with speed or firepower compared to modern machines. But it represents the birth of American tank development, a time when the US was taking its first steps into mechanized warfare. Without the M1917, and the lessons learned from it, America's tank industry might have struggled to catch up in World War II. Every Abrams roaring across the desert today owes a small debt to that little light tank from 1917. So, what do you think of the M1917? Would you want to see one up close in action, or even own one if money and availability weren't an issue? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into military history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Auto Reviews for more content just like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.